Okay, awesome. So we have some prepared questions, which we'll ask Dr. King at the beginning to reply in as much detail as possible. And then after we finish our prepared questions, we will open the floor for everyone to ask in the chat box if you have any other questions you might want to ask. However, if you want to ask them yourselves, then you can put it on the chat box and then put a star next to it. And then I'll give you the floor to start and ask any questions you might have. And yeah, because active participation is always encouraged. So let's get started. Thank you so much, Dr. King, for joining us today. So
Yeah,
first,
thank you for having me. Thank you.
yeah, great. First of all, I'll introduce a bit about Dr. King. So Dr. King is an instructor in the Department of Psychology at UBC. Dr. King's main research interests include health psychology, stress and coping, personality, and interpersonal dynamics. His current research addresses the question of how stress unfolds within social context of varying size and complexity, from dyads and families to broader social and cultural circumstances. Other academic interests include socioeconomic factors in health, the impact of stigma and discrimination on well-being, and the role of meaning in trauma. In addition to multiple publications in peer-reviewed journals, he's also the co-author of 2 undergraduate textbooks. Dr. King has been leading courses in the areas of health, personality psychology, and the psychology of death and dying at UBC for the past 8 years. Welcome, Dr. King.
Thank you.
So, the first question is, what is one psychology experiment you love talking about?
Yeah, so this was actually I love this question, but I had in mind right away what my go-to would be currently. So most students are probably familiar with a lot of the research looking at terror management theory and finding that, when people get really threatened, and in particular when their mortality is threatened in some way, what's been found in a number of studies is that they essentially end up expressing more conservative and sometimes even anti-immigrant, very sort of extremist kinds of attitudes against people that are different from them, right? And one of the reasons I've always loved that research in general, although that's not the study that I'll bring up, is that tells us that scaring people is a way of creating division. And I think in the current political climate, that's something we all need to be thinking about for a lot of obvious reasons that I don't need to get into. But there's this amazing, really exciting line of research coming from, he's a researcher by the name of John Bargh from Yale. And what he's found is the reverse association is also true. And in a few different experiments, he's shown that when you make people feel safe, they are more likely to endorse positive attitudes towards outgroup members. And they're more likely to be pro-immigrant, and if asked about that question specifically. And the way that they've manipulated this is so interesting and actually really relevant to the pandemic that we're currently in. It was one series of experiments, I think published in 2011, where he found that participants who had been vaccinated were less likely to respond negatively to disease threat and more likely to be pro-immigrant. And then he had another experiment where he had participants wash their hands, and washing their hands actually made them basically unable to be determined as any different from people who were otherwise very liberal in their social values. And then a more recent study, they even found that making people imagine themselves as being in sort of completely invulnerable to any kind of physical harm also made them adopt completely liberal, pro-social attitudes and values, particularly anything that was related to social values, not necessarily economic values, but social values. And what I love about that is that I feel like that's kind of a bit of an answer to so many of our problems today. We need leaders who are able to make people feel safe. The implications of that finding to me are just, so important and so, so pressing. And if I think about an example of someone like that, some of you may be familiar with the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. She does an amazing job making people feel safe. She's an example of that, how you can do that. And I feel like when we see research that has those kinds of implications for real world problems, even though that research is completely unrelated to anything I've ever done myself, any work that I do, I love that kind of stuff, right? That's the kind of stuff that we all need to be thinking about because it has these real implications for how we understand the world around us. So that's a study I've been bringing up a lot, this idea that if we make people feel safe, we could have a better society. It sounds so easy in a way, but we're seeing so much that's sort of in the opposite direction right now. So
Yeah, I think these types of researchers are super important, especially considering the so important applications they have nowadays. I think it's great to consider those type of research.
Mhm.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Yeah, you're welcome.
Um, so the second question is, what made you choose to major in psychology?
Well, to be honest, I took psychology for a year in my undergrad and I had no idea what I wanted to do. So I just took psychology like a lot of people do.
Yeah.
Um, I didn't really, I mean, I liked it the first year, but then I needed to take some time off because I wasn't really confident that that was what I wanted to do. And in my year and a half off, I ended up working for some various organizations that worked with developmentally and intellectually challenged adults. So various organizations like community living organizations. Um, and even though, you know, my education didn't actually focus on that at all, it really kind of ignited this true, you know, this real interest in psychology. And I thought, yeah, that's actually what I want to do. You know, I already kind of started that path, and then it was just a couple of years later that I decided I wanted to go all the way to the PhD. So you know, I'll be honest, I've always, and still to this day, I have so many interests that I still have a hard time deciding what I want to do. Which, you know, maybe to some people is a little scary to imagine that, you know, you could go all that way, but I just love, I get so excited about so many different topics, you know, that still I question myself and whether I'm doing, you know, the
Yeah.
one thing that I want to do forever. And I don't think that you know, I don't think I'll ever find that one thing. I think I'll probably do a lot of things, but
Yeah, I think it's definitely too like hard to choose, one thing, one interest, because there's
yeah,
just so many things out there. Yeah, I totally agree.
yeah, yeah.
So great. The next question is, why do you choose health psychology as your area of focus, and what is your favorite part about it?
Yeah, I think, you know, it was a topic that I always had this really intrinsic interest in. And I don't even, you know, I can't say exactly what that interest stems from. I think in a lot of ways, I've always been really drawn to anything that is in some way informative to this idea of the mind body connection. And I think there's just something that I've always loved about that. I think in a lot of ways, that connection, which is, you know, in a lot of ways fundamental to health psychology, right? Even if we don't always talk about it or name it directly, I think it's something that is still, even in today's world, overlooked. You know, it's an example to me of something that, you know, I wish more people noticed and I wish more people recognized. So there's something about that mind body connection that I just find fascinating, and I'm so interested in, you know. So that's one of the things that really underlies my interest in the field, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, I
But I
think.
mean, you know, I mean, how I, you know, I mean, to be honest, you know, when it comes to grad school and you're applying to different programs, you know, you apply to multiple programs. Health psychology was one of many, right? I was really interested in it, and you know, I got the acceptance to UBC, and had the choice between that and going to Australia, to Monash University, and I decided that since I would have been completely broke if I went to Australia, I was going to
Yeah.
I was going to stay in Canada.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, I love health psychology. You know, it's not my only interest in psychology. That to me is even scarier than choosing a career in general to choose only one area in psychology. But
Mhm.
I mean, I do love that about health psychology. I really and I love the applied aspect of it too. I think, you know, it's a very applied field.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really important as well. Great. So, next question is, are you aware of any other career paths in health psychology in addition to research and teaching?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely more clinical routes that can be taken in health psychology. You know, often you do need to get a clinical PhD still to do that. In the US, health psychology is even more popular than it is in Canada. And in the US, a lot of the grad programs are actually clinical health psychology degrees specifically. And we don't, at least not that I know of still, there are only two or three dedicated health psychology programs, formal programs in Canada anyway, at the graduate level. And I don't think any of them are clinical health programs specifically. But that's definitely another possibility that's out there. And, you know, like a lot of degrees in psychology, you know, getting a job at a hospital or consulting in research. I mean, I know that's still research based, but there are those other careers that exist outside of academia specifically with health psychology that perhaps don't even exist with other subdisciplines, right? You know, definitely that applied aspect that is there that I think is really relevant.
Yeah.
I mean, and then, you know, for me, I'm focused even more on teaching nowadays and writing, and not, I haven't gone down that typical, you know, academic path either. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I definitely think there's always different paths you can take.
yeah. And I would say, you know, I think in a lot of ways it's like any subdiscipline in psychology, you can always kind of carve your own path if you know, have some, you know, different skills, you know, and really strong interests in different directions, you know, you can kind of carve your own path to some extent. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great to know. Yeah. So I think this question is a bit related to before, but how
Yeah.
have your research interests changed over time?
They've changed drastically. Well, if anyone, I know there are a few students here that I've had in my classes, and I always bring this up on the first day, but my very first research experience was in dreams and dreaming. So it's
Wow.
totally
That's
out of,
crazy. Yeah.
yeah. The university I went to in Ontario, Trent University, actually had a really strong dream research program. And so I was lucky enough to sort of be have the experience of getting involved in that research early on in my undergrad. And I did a little bit of that research into my master's, but my honors thesis was in that area. And, you know, obviously it's a topic that isn't common, so it wasn't one that was easy to continue. But then I went on in my master's to study the topic of spiritual intelligence, which is also completely, you know, a fringe topic in psychology. You know, and then when it came to my PhD, to be honest, there was no one that was really ideally suited to those interests that I could find that I could work with, which is a challenge that,
Yeah.
you know, a lot of people will encounter with grad school, especially if you're interested in something, you know, that is not, you know, mainstream. But that's what sort of landed me, you know, at that point. I came to UBC to study health psychology. And, you know, I'm really glad that although I was sort of sad to let go of those other interests because I did love those topics,
Yeah.
you know, I feel like it kind of made me feel a little bit more confident and doing something that was a little bit more mainstream. I feel like it allowed me to sort of get to the point that I wanted to get to, if that makes sense. But I mean, generally speaking, I've always been really passionate about anything that has to do with how people overcome adversity, you know, how they find meaning in their experiences. That kind of stuff has always really, really excited me. And now more recently, we're doing some work. I've been involved in research on pandemics, actually, specifically.
Wow.
Yeah, and how people cope with the threat of pandemics. So looking at, and you know, one of the cool findings is that we've seen consistently now is that empathy is a very important factor in motivating people to actually take health precautions. So we found this in all kinds of different diseases, H1N1, West Nile, the flu, and now we actually confirmed it. The findings haven't been published yet, but we've confirmed it in regards to COVID as well.
Wow.
People who are more empathetic are more likely to wash their hands. They're more likely to engage in these recommended health precautions. And, you know, it's like, I love the topic of empathy as well, you know, but it's, I really like that research. I really like that research. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds super interesting as
Mhm.
well. So yeah, the next question is, could you tell us a bit about the courses you're teaching at UBC?
Yeah, sure. Well, so one of them is health psychology, which is just like a crash course in the field, really. You know, the field's pretty broad. So that's the first course that I ever taught at UBC. And then personality psychology is the second course I started teaching, and I've been teaching for some time now. And, you know, I love health psychology, and I always kind of joke with my students, but personality psych has kind of become my favorite course to teach in a lot of ways, um,
Yeah.
if I'm just being really honest. But, you know, one of the reasons I think I love personality is that it's kind of, the course has kind of become for me like a reflection on who we are, you know, as people and as humans. And I feel like there's so much to be gained in terms of understanding, you know, our current state and where we find ourselves today. So I've sort of developed this internal passion for that course that, you know, like my relationship with that course is sort of one that I care about in a very different way. So I love teaching that course. And then I teach the psychology of death and dying, which I also love talking about, even though, you know, it's a tough topic at times. And then recently, sex differences. or psychology of gender and sex differences, really. Yeah. Oh, do we?
Ooh, yeah, sorry. I think my
Oh, that's
internet
okay. No,
cut
I
out.
wasn't sure what was
Yeah,
happening. That's okay.
yeah, I was like, yeah, I think my internet got cut out. Sorry about that. Okay. Yeah, actually, the next question
Yeah.
is about that course. You taught a course on psychology of sex differences this summer.
Yeah.
So wanted to ask you, what made you take up teaching that course? And does it fit into the general themes that psychology usually explore, or is it like a more novel theme in itself?
Yeah. So I guess I'll answer the second question first. I would say that gender, it goes both ways. So it's a course. I refer to it as a psych of gender, but technically it's psych of sex differences. But we talk about gender, obviously. I feel like gender is a topic that is sort of a theme in itself in psychology in a lot of ways. But at the same time, the course touches on all kinds of domains that are relevant to gender, right? From relationships to mental health, to biology and heritability, to socialization. So I mean, it does hit on a lot of those themes that come up in a number of different courses. But I would say that what it really is in the end, the course is an examination of what sex differences are, whether they exist, in what domains they're relevant, and what we're really talking about when we refer to them in the first place. And I'll be honest, um, sometimes I feel like maybe I'm a little bit too honest in terms of how I think about things, but I'll be honest, I hate the topic of sex differences. And what I mean by that on the surface is that when I look around in my life or have my experiences, in my own personal life, I don't like when people bring up sex differences. I don't feel like I really fit those patterns myself. They don't mean a lot to me personally. I hate that people kind of obsess about sex differences. So
I
the,
totally get it. Yeah, for sure.
yeah, but so the title of the course could possibly be misleading to some people, because what the course is in the end is an examination of what sex differences have been observed in psychology and what's really going on, with a recognition that these are not consistent patterns that are seen for everyone, right? Which is a really important point. So, but one of the reasons I love talking about it, I think, is because I have those feelings about gender myself, and also because I love talking about difficult topics, which may sound strange, but I just love, if I know that a topic is uncomfortable for people to talk about, I'm like one of the first people that will say, I'll talk about it with you. We can sit down and talk about it together. And that's why I love teaching death and dying as well, because death and dying is such a difficult topic for people to talk about. And I really love stepping into that environment and leading that conversation, or helping and assisting with that conversation. So maybe that's a strange kind of thing to
No,
like,
I
but
definitely think that, yeah, these type of conversations and these type of topics sometimes bring up the most interesting, it's like the most
yeah,
interesting conversations, and even the most necessary conversations. Like if you talk about sex and stuff, it's very important to see the gender differences and the gender inequality as well.
yeah,
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 thank you for sharing that with us.
yeah, you're welcome. Yeah.
So the next question is, would you mind telling us a bit about your blog, The State of Us, and why did you decide to start it?
Yeah, so I mean, the funny thing about, if we go back to the question about why I chose health psychology and all of that, at the end of the day, I feel like in terms of who I really am and what I really love doing is I love writing. And that's something that I've always loved doing since I was like 12. I used to write poems and things and everything. So um, and so so I've always written in a way that was not academic, I guess you could say, that was not quite academic or not completely academic. And so the blog was, I had a blog. It was I guess about 12 or more years ago. I called it David Bothered. I ended up changing that name to The State of Us. I needed to sort of change it up at some point, but it was kind of a similar kind of theme of just like a reflection on the world, and pretty much anything, I guess, just sharing my thoughts about things. But one of the reasons that's so important to me is that as much as I love academia, academia can be very constraining in terms of creativity in some respects. And that's okay. I mean, that's just the reality of it in some ways, Obviously, creative thinking has a role, But, you know, in some of those more creative expressions of thought, like you might see in writing, that's something that I still need to do for myself. You know, I need to write something and not think about APA style, you know, when I'm writing it.
Yeah.
So, you know, I need to not think about like, oh, am I using this one word in the one way that I'm allowed to use this word? You
Yeah.
know, like when you're writing a paper, like a formal publication or a manuscript in psychology, like, you know, it's not like you could just use a different word. You have to use that one word because that's the word that everyone uses. And
Yeah.
that's it, you know? So, that's one of the reasons that's so important to me is I, you know, at the end of the day, like I love what I do and I'm really passionate about what I do, but it's not all of me. And that other kind of writing is an important, you know, an important part, I guess, of all of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, as a writer myself, I definitely understand when you were talking about like
Yeah. Yeah.
ways to actually not write like academically. I totally get it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like, it's funny when you're writing like it academically, you have those moments and they're really rare where you're like, oh, this is actually kind of like a creative way of saying this. And you get so excited about it, but it's like one sentence.
Yeah, exactly. They're just
Yeah.
not all the essay for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I totally get that.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And then the next question is actually about the academic books you wrote,
Mm.
which are how does it feel being co-author of the two textbooks, which are well recognized in the university setting, and how did you end up becoming part of the writing team?
Well, so the health psychology book um, was the result of my supervisor at the time, my PhD supervisor, Anita DeLongis. She had been approached previously to help write like a Canadian edition of an American book, and she asked if I'd be willing to help out. So that's how we got involved in that, and we just published the second edition, which is significantly improved over the first edition. So I'm really happy with that. And then the personality textbook, I was already using the American edition of the book, and it was a really good book, a really popular American edition. And I just got an email randomly from the publisher saying, you know, we're developing a Canadian edition. If anyone would like to, you know, offer reviews, or even if you're interested in contributing. And right away I emailed back and said, yeah, I'd be really interested in like, you know, co-authoring or helping with this. And it ended up that it was basically just my lead project. So I became the lead Canadian author. I know. So, which I was just really cool. I mean, it's you know, like I said, I love personality psychology too. So now I have both of the books have come out in second editions just this year. So it's been a really good experience. I mean, to be honest, I'm kind of humble about it, because to me, it's like, as much as I obviously think textbooks are important, my big goal is to write what I call a book, you know, not a textbook. So, um, you know, I mean, I think it's great, but you know, for me, I have like, you know, it's still, there's still textbooks, right? But you know, I mean, if I had to say what I love about the experience, is that you know, I do love contributing to educational content. And one of the things I think that where I've seen some passion expressed of my own in those projects, is textbooks are almost an interesting way to do a little bit of social advocacy, because in both textbooks, you know, and to be honest, the American editions did not do this, but you know, in both textbooks, I made a point of including content on different groups of people who were disadvantaged, or who were maybe experiencing higher than normal stress for some kind of reason. You know, issues that were not only pertinent to Canadians as a whole, but also to specific groups in Canada, you know, that may be marginalized or disadvantaged for some reason, and that nevertheless still reflects, you know, real topics in research. But you know, in some way, that's almost my way of trying to encourage that conversation and some awareness about some of those social issues by including that content in those textbooks. You know, it's interesting when you think about a textbook and you think, you know, you assume that a textbook just includes all of the content that it's supposed to include. You know, you think, oh, well, there's someone that, you know, has looked at the field and said, this is everything that's that we should put in this book. But the reality is there are a lot of little decisions to make about, you know, the examples that you use, the populations that you highlight, you know, the groups that you highlight. And so that's been a really cool way of engaging in some advocacy, I think in some ways it is, you know, in terms of possibly at least encouraging some awareness of some of these different topics or issues. So that's something I really like about it. Yeah.
I think it's very interesting to see the perspective of someone who actually wrote the book as a student that just read what is there. And
Yeah. Oh, I think your camera froze again. Yeah. So yeah, that's
yeah,
okay.
but yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting how like to get the perspective of someone who actually wrote the book, because us as students that are programmed to memorize everything that's in there.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
guys, like this perspective you give to us. Thank you so much.
Yeah. You're welcome. Yeah.
And then, so now I wanted to ask you a bit more about your experience as an undergraduate student.
Mm.
What is something you wish you knew as an undergraduate student?
One of the things, it's one piece of advice that I often give to undergrads that I wish I would have somehow been aware of, but it's, to be honest, I don't think it's something that a lot of people would say, or a lot of people would offer in terms of advice. But I think, one of the things I wish I would have known is that you don't have to, or no, let me say this differently. Any one person's advice, from whether it's a mentor or faculty member or whatever, any one person's advice is not necessarily the only way to see it. And any one person's advice should not necessarily be followed or adhered to strictly. And that's not to say that you shouldn't respect the advice of mentors in your undergrad. You should really be listening to everything that everyone's telling you. You should be taking it in, but you don't have to take it all so strictly and apply it strictly, because the reality is, there are a lot of different opinions about the quote unquote right way of doing it all. And what that amounts to in the end is the reality that there are a lot of different ways you can do it. And a lot of faculty members and a lot of professors, like all people in any role, often feel very strongly about, their views and their beliefs on, the right or wrong way to do something, right? Or they feel very, I guess they feel very committed to however they did it themselves, and that's the only way they'll ever recommend it to anyone else. And at the end of the day, listen to all of this, take it in, but realize that you can still work around that, and you can do things in different ways. If you're motivated enough, you really can do things in different ways. I guess that sounds a little cliche, because it sounds like I'm kind of saying, whatever you can believe in, you can do it. But that's not exactly what I'm getting at. I'm just kind of saying, if someone tells you, especially if someone comes to you and says, this is the one way to do it, you have to do it this way, don't believe them completely. That's probably the way that they feel, about it. In most cases, there are multiple ways to do things, and there are multiple paths in the end, Yeah. So that's something I always think about when anyone's ever asking me in particular about grad school, or like that transition from, your undergrad to grad school. There are always lots of ways to do things.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. Yeah, because like sometimes you just receive so many different advices, so different from different people. You're like, which one should I follow now, right? Yeah, I totally get what you were saying.
Yeah.
Okay, so what was the most difficult part of your undergraduate degree?
Yeah, I had to think about this a little bit, because I will say that I didn't have any, horribly negative experiences. I did have a little bit of strange tension at one point with my master's supervisor in Ontario, and it was out of a misunderstanding and that kind of thing. But that's not even something now that I think back on too much. I think if I really had to think about the greatest challenge throughout, and it continued even past my undergrad and into grad school, was just trying to maintain that balance between work life and home life and personal life. And I was always someone, and I still feel this way, I was always someone who just really liked to maintain my own personal life outside of academia. I wasn't the kind of person who was motivated to sort of let myself completely, be completely taken over by it. And it's easy to let that happen. And you know what, it's not something I would judge if someone wants to, dive right in fully, and that's great. But just for me, I really wanted to keep things separate. And so, I found that challenging. I ended up managing to do that. And to be honest, in a lot of ways, one of how I did it was I wasn't always as social at school, and with class, other people in classes or in some of those social activities, because I wanted to get home and live my personal life too. I didn't want to let myself be consumed by it. But when you do that, when you don't let yourself sort of dive in completely and you want to maintain that balance, you're kind of always trying to maintain that balance. It is really a balancing act that you have to be doing constantly. And there are some sacrifices in that, in doing that, I think. But again, it was important to me, and that I continued on even in grad school. I did that. I wasn't, as a grad student, to be honest, I had some friends obviously who were grad students, but I wasn't super social in in the department at the time, because I just had my that other part of my life, and it was really important for me to maintain that non-academic part of my life as well. If that makes sense. And I know that a lot of students struggle with that, and I know that's something that I've heard from a lot of students, that they often don't realize that it's possible to try to maintain that balance.
Yeah, I think balance is always important, especially now.
Yeah.
Like everything is just combining to one, right? Like you have
Yeah.
your school at home, and you're like, how do I find my personal space?
Yeah.
I think that's definitely something to really important.
Yeah. And that's a good point, that now, we're in a situation where it's perhaps even, more difficult to keep it separated somehow in some weird way, or I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends on people's own experiences, but yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so what advice would you have for first year students interested in psychology?
Um, yeah, so I thought of three main things. So one of them, I think, the first one I think is kind of obvious, but I think, if I were to go back, even thinking about that last question, it sort of is another answer to that question as well, in terms of what I may have done differently. But, the more you can think about your long-term goals, the better. The more you can really think ahead about things, especially now, things are even more competitive than when I was in my undergrad, or at least it feels that way. It seems that way, when I look at what students are going through. So the more you can do that, the better. Realizing, though, at the same time, that you don't have to have it perfectly carved out either, but for example, if you have a sense that you want to go to grad school, well, you got to plan ahead in some ways to do that. You have to think ahead, right? And so, sometimes students need that kind of simple advice. Although I would assume that most students who are tuning into this are probably already thinking ahead. So I'm sure that that's not some kind of really, insightful advice to a great extent. The other would just be, like I said before, create your own path, and you can create your own path. There are a lot of students that I've seen who have gone through, at whatever level, their master's, their PhD, and gotten to a point and realized that they don't want to, do the academic path, but they still love the area. And, a lot of them go into, down other career paths, whether working for, maybe some kind of private industry, working for government, writing policy. I mean, there are all kinds of other things that you can do, right? And then the last thing I was going to say was, don't let any one comment or one sort of experience that is discouraging really hold you back. And I'll give you an example. So so I had done the dream research in my undergrad. That was already kind of, a little bit out there in terms of topics. But that didn't matter. It was just my honors thesis. But then in my master's, I did research on spiritual intelligence. And a member of my committee told my supervisor at the time, and she later told me about this, but he told her, you can't let him study this. You can't let him have this as his topic. He will not have a career in psychology if he does this topic. He flat out told her, if he does this, he's not going to go anywhere from this point. And obviously that was a scary thing to hear. But my supervisor, she was still really supportive, and I said, well, I don't really buy that. And I think, that's again sort of an example of these very, very narrow one of my SHRC applications and got funding from SHRC using that topic. So it could not have been that much of a problem, right? But there are those different attitudes that you're always coming up against. And sometimes they can come in a way that seems very, very discouraging. You know, you could be really excited about a topic that is a really valid topic, and you might feel really discouraged by someone's, you know, really in the end, what is a very narrow view that might be coming from them or something like that, or some kind of judgment. And, you know, you got to kind of find the confidence, I get, to work through that. But, you know, I think you have to try to maintain that if you can.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's really valuable advice for sure. And then we just wanted to ask you, the transition to online schooling is not really easy. So
Mm.
do you have any tips for students to succeed virtually?
Yeah, I mean, and you know, the first thing I'll say is that it hasn't been easy for me either. You know, if anyone's interested in hearing the other side of it too, you know, it's only in this term I taught both summer terms, and then also had to finish up, you know, the last winter term too when we transitioned online. I did not feel confident about a lot of what I was doing over the last few terms, and it wasn't until this term that I started to feel a little more situated and used to the situation. Um, and you know, so I'm hoping that maybe students are as well. But one of the things I would say is really important, and I found to be important, is still try to engage in your daily routine. You know, still wake up, shower, get, get dressed, you know, fix your hair, whatever you have to fix. You know, try to make yourself feel like you're actually starting a day, even if you're just moving into a different room in your house. You know, that's all you're doing.
Same one, yeah, I totally get it.
Yeah. You know, I think that's a really important thing, because what it does is it helps to maintain those feelings of normalcy to some extent, you know, a normal routine. Because the differences in our lifestyle, I think those differences are some of the things that are really stressing us out in the end, you know. And then, you know, the other thing I would say, there was one other thing I was going to say. I was going to say, try to approach studying with some normalcy in mind as well. So, you know, online exams are very different, and that format is throwing a lot of students off. But I would, I've been stressing to my students to still take notes. So, you know, if you're watching a recorded lecture, take notes while you're watching that lecture. Do everything that you would do otherwise in person. You know, try to engage in those exact same habits. Don't change everything completely now, you know, if you've already been doing things a certain way. So maintain those habits, I would say is important advice for studying in particular. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, we just wanted to ask you about like more tips. How can
Yeah.
students cope better with the workload? Do you have like any other tips for that?
I mean, if whenever anyone asks me about coping, and that's something I've obviously thought about in teaching health psychology, my go-to is always to get outside and spend time in nature. You know, I know it sounds sometimes like it's just too easy of a response, but you know, it really is, especially right now. It's so important to make sure that you're getting outside and, you know, spending time in nature. I think one of the things that really scared me when they first, you know, when the government of in Canada first started to tell people to you know, isolate and not socialize, they were actually in the beginning flat out telling people to not leave their homes, basically to stay home. And I was thinking at the time, I was like, oh my God, this is not good advice. I mean, people are not going to be okay mentally by doing this, you know.
Yeah.
So you know, I would say just really make that effort to get outside, because there's nothing that's stopping you from getting outside, you know. And if you can spend some time in a park, in an area that, you know, has trees, it's, we know it's a stress, you know, it helps to reduce stress. So that's always my kind of go-to advice, as easy as that may sound. But you know, at the same time, I've had students in the past who have told me that they hate spending time in nature, and I'm always like, what? How are you doing this?
Yeah.
Um, but you know, I think maybe sometimes people think they don't really enjoy it, but if they actually let themselves, you know, just kind of relax a little bit, they might enjoy it. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Me myself as a biker, then like when you go into nature and then you explore it, just like such a satisfying experience. I definitely agree.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Really nice. Okay. So the next question is, from your experience teaching, what qualities do successful students in your courses possess?
Yeah, I thought this was a really good question, because I know what the answers are in my own mind to this question, but I don't think I've ever really articulated it completely in the end. So it was good in making me think about what I have noticed. And the one that I guess kind of sounds a little bit obvious is critical thinking. But if I were to say what that actually looks like from my perspective, critical thinking is obviously really essential. But what that looks like in practice, from my perspective, in a way that clearly results in better performance and better outcomes, is really grasping the bigger picture of topics and also grasping the ways that different topics are connected or related. I think that's a really beneficial thing. And it's something whenever I'm teaching my courses, I always try to do that. I try to draw connections between things. But I feel like if you have this broader understanding of everything and how it fits together, you're going to retain all of that information better. You're going to understand concepts better. You're going to have multiple points of reference for things. So I think that should be a goal that students should always have. Try to grasp this on another level, if that's possible.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, no, for sure. That's it. It does make sense for sure. But
yeah, and I was sorry. And just one other thing I would say, the last thing I would say about that is the other one. I think one of the main predictors of success is also just staying engaged in the course. And what I mean by that is, really thinking about things, how they apply to your personal life, how they apply outside the classroom. Like, think about that. Even if you're not going to be tested on it, think about it. Spend time, really thinking about how things matter or how they might have consequences in different ways, because that too contributes to better understanding of the material. And I've seen the students who generally perform the best in my classes are those who are engaged on that level. They're thinking about things in a real way, not just for the purpose of memorizing material,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's super important. So those were our prepared questions. Thank you so much, Dr. King, for answering all of our questions.
You're welcome.
Great.
Yeah.
And before opening the floor for anyone that might have any other questions, I wanted to mention that our next event is Grad School Series that will happen the third week of October. So we advise you to keep a look out for that. And then after this, then I would like to open the floor for everyone that might want to have any other questions and might want to ask them themselves, or if you want to type it on the chat as well, there's also that option. So yeah, you can also raise your hand or maybe just any of you have any other questions. I don't know, we'll just wait for a few people if you have any other questions.
I think Shima has a question.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So Dr. King, I was in your personality psych class, and
Yeah.
I remember one point that you brought up that was kind of depressing was that the more informed people become, the more politically polarized they become. How do you think this can be the case in something like a pandemic, where you'd think being more informed would tend to sway people to like a general consensus? Like it seems almost like it goes against what you think would happen.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's a at the end of the day, what the research that you're referring to, I mean, I will say that research is sort of limited in the sense that it hasn't necessarily been replicated so much that we can be super confident about that finding. But it basically does tell us, or it suggests to us, that the smarter people are, the more likely they are to sort of figure out the meaning of information quickly and then determine whether it fits with their narrative or whether they should basically ignore it, right? I think that was the study that we were talking about.
Yes.
And I mean, yeah, you're right. That absolutely has really serious implications in something like the pandemic. But I think what that tells us is that, and it's kind of a message that we've gotten from other lines of research in the past. It tells us that just giving people information isn't enough. That alone is not enough. Now, it's enough for some people. There are people that are able to take a more objective approach to things and may not, for example, may not let their ego get involved to the same extent, right? Because that matters too in all of that. But I think it really just tells us that giving information alone, just providing information alone is not enough. And I think that's an important lesson even for public health officials to maybe consider, right? There need to be other motivating factors. And, some of those motivating factors, I think, are kind of like they're emotional factors in a lot of cases. Or, like we were talking about earlier, some people are motivated to adhere to a certain worldview because they're scared. those are things those are other factors that are mattering in all of that. So I think, yeah, the message is we need to do more than just give people information. Maybe we need to make them feel safe. Maybe we need to make them feel empathetic. Maybe we need to sort of trigger a sense of empathy in them. And that might help motivate them in some other direction. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Thank you. So does anyone else have any other questions you might want to ask Professor King?
I think Helena.
Hello.
Hi, Helena.
Hi, I also took a personality course a while ago. I don't know if it's been maybe about 3 years or something. It was one of my first upper level psych courses. I'm getting I'm getting some echo. I don't know.
Oh.
Anyways, but a lot of what you said I relate to, in terms of not being able to pick a path. I haven't even been able to pick one major. I decided to do two because I couldn't decide, and I relate to that. I've been trying to figure out my master's applications, and the whole question of you have to make one specific proposal has been quite a struggle. So I related a lot to that. But I also found one of my main interests in psychology is, well, actually not even just in psychology, is the idea of empathy. I'm actually in English honors, and I'm writing my English thesis on empathy. So it's definitely a topic that I find particularly fascinating. And a lot of what you said made me think about the research of Brené Brown. Do you know her? She's a So and what you were talking about in terms of the terror management theory sounded a lot with what she says about scarcity culture. And also the other things you mentioned in terms of empathy. So I just thought I'd bring it up and ask if you know her, what do you think about all that?
I don't. Is there a specific research finding of hers that you're thinking of that?
I don't know. I couldn't think of a specific thing, but then when you're the idea of scarcity, the fear that people have, it seemed to match what you said. I don't know if I've been listening to a lot of podcasts from her, so I can't pull out the research name out of the top of my head. It's not me.
Because no. I mean, I'm aware. I know who she is, and I've seen her speak in some cases. I'm just not sure what research specifically you might be thinking of, but I mean, I would say that on the topic of empathy, I think it's one of those things that we need to really spend more time, not only researching and studying, but also just talking about and trying to cultivate, because I think what she talks about in some of her work too is how, traits like narcissism and these other problematic traits are, causing a lot of problems. And, there's limited evidence that those traits may be increasing as well. And I think that what we're seeing in a lot of the different social divides that we're experiencing is sort of a clash between different traits, human traits that are just not really working together. And I really wish that people were more mindful, people, society at large were more mindful of the importance and the role of these traits and how either valuable and influential they can be or how problematic they can be in some cases, and I know this is probably off topic of your question now at this point, but it makes me think of a student in my earlier class today brought it up. If we look at some world leaders like, Bolsonaro in Brazil, for example, we're looking at an example there of a human trait like narcissism and probably some sociopathic tendencies too, literally resulting in the destruction of the natural world. These traits matter, and that's one of the reasons that I love personality so much is that, I want people to really pay attention to these traits. We need to be more discerning of these traits when we see them, right? And we need to better cultivate traits like empathy, right? So that's off topic. I'm sorry.
I mean, I've been kind of off topic too. I should have been more academic, but I guess that's one of the examples of how I am not super academic either sometimes, and I'm quite drawn to the more creative writing sort of side of things. Yeah, and then I guess with empathy, I think one of the things that is very good at cultivating empathy is art and stories, right? And basically I'm writing my undergraduate thesis on how on this idea of how art can evoke empathy and sort of create empathy. So I've been very interested in the topic.
Yeah, nice.
Anyways,
That sounds interesting. I mean, you know, on that, those kinds of, I think in a lot of ways, you know, we're maybe realizing now that we're living in a world that doesn't focus enough on that stuff, you know, and we need to hopefully shift that focus a bit, right?
yeah, definitely, because I think like at the end of the day, well, I volunteer in a crisis helpline, and in, I think those questions I've always sort of considered them, I guess, more hypothetically, and then like now when I'm in that volunteer, I see how real, like it's not like sometimes people talk about things like empathy as if they're like all airy fairy and doesn't really mean anything in the real world, and it's like without that people die, right? And just empathy can be enough to help someone want to live. So it's not an unimportant concept. I think it's very, very serious. And yeah.
Well, I mean, definitely when you see a situation that has really negative consequences because of a lack of empathy, then you really notice it, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. So I think Alicia is also raising her hand.
Hi, Dr. King.
Hi.
I was just wondering, I know you talked about when you applied to grad school, you were like applying for like different things. And I was just wondering how you chose your supervisor and like what kind of traits you were looking for in that. Like, how do you know it's the right fit when because it's kind of a big decision. You're stuck with them for a long time.
Yeah, and so that's a good question, but I mean, I probably didn't do it the smartest way because my Anita DeLongis, she agreed to work with me over the phone. So, and so I went out to visit her in the lab after she had already accepted me. So luckily though, it ended up working out really well, and it was a really positive experience for me. But I would say that the reason it worked for me and the reason that her and I worked so well together was because she was really good at letting me work on my own. I'm someone who likes to work independently, and micromanaging. I mean, most people don't enjoy being micromanaged, but I just, really can't stand it. And I don't, she's really good at she was really good at letting me work on my own and work independently. And she was there for me when I needed her, and so that, I think what you need to do is you need to really think about your working style too, and how you normally like to work. Do you need to be at work all the time? Do you need to be around other people, or do you like to work independently? You really need to think about just your basic working style, never mind obviously, the person's personality and are they the kind of person you would like to be around, but also just your working style, I think, is important to consider.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I don't know if there were questions in the chat here.
Yeah, I think Zane had a question about on the topic of political polarization.
Oh yeah, okay.
And since we know that as humans have a tendency to double down on our preconceived beliefs via cognitive dissonance and our other biases, how can we use psychology to have conversations with people on the other side of the political spectrum?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This is a question that I get a lot from students at the very end of, especially at the end of personality, because we talk about some of these bigger picture issues. And I will say, first of all, that there's no one sure way of having those conversations effectively. You'll always encounter people that just not change their position. It doesn't matter what you do, how you approach it. But some of the tactics that have been suggested to work and have been shown to work are, trying to validate something. If you're having a conversation with someone, validate something that they've said. Find something that they've said that maybe has even just a smidgen of truth to it, and repeat that back, or just repeat something back that they've said. Somehow make them feel like they're really being heard, because often what people are looking for is just to be heard. Often that's all that people really want, is they want someone to give them some attention and to actually listen. So that's one way to approach it. And even in online discussions, that could be helpful in some respects. And then to also not actually criticize their view, but instead just present an alternative view. That's been suggested by a lot of psychologists as a sort of communication tactic that can lead to better communication outcomes, and possibly a person considering that other information. But I mean, you're up against a lot of variables. there are conversations at the end of the day that you try to have with people, and you just kind of have to walk away and say, this person's not changing their mind at all. But I think trying to approach it in a more balanced way and hearing the person is helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. And then I think we have one last question, which seems a bit more political, I think. Not to get too political, but I took your class like 3 or 4, and we did a case study. So I don't know, like you, unless if you would like to answer that.
All I can do at this point is just kind of shake my head. I don't know what to say about it at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Zane says, thank you for answering that question. That was really helpful.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
Awesome. So I think those were all the questions we had for today. Thank you for everyone that participated, and thank you so much, Dr. King, for answering all of our questions. Very detailed.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate your energy and your support in this case.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. King. Angeli over here is our photographer from PSA, and would like to take a picture if everybody is comfortable with. Those who are not, they can certainly switch off their cameras, and those who want can certainly switch them on, please.
Okay. Yeah.
Whenever you're ready, Angeli.
Okay. Whenever. Just smile, I guess. Okay. 1, 2, 3. And I'm gonna get a couple more. 1, 2, 3. Okay. I'm gonna take one more.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Smile. Okay.
Awesome.
You look great, guys.
This is how we take pictures nowadays.
I just took a bunch of screenshots, but yeah. Thank you.
No problem.
But thank you so much, Dr. King, for being with us tonight.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrea, for hosting this event for us today. And thank you, everyone, for coming in. As Andrea mentioned, we would be having a grad school series sometime in the 3rd week of October. Please be on a lookout at our various social media pages. We would be updating them as and when more information comes our way. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you. Bye.
Oh, Dr. King, was that Scout or Hunter barking in the background earlier?
That was Scout out back. Scout's a little louder. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for remembering, though.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. It was really nice seeing you after the summer.
Yeah. Nice seeing you, Mohit. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.